Let's roll. You have found the Sit Down with Russ Latino, where we explore the issues and people that are shaping Mississippi's future and touch on the great culture that we have here that makes Mississippi a wonderful place to call home. I'm your host, Russ Latino. Thanks for joining us on our second episode of the Sit Down, joined in the booth by the incomparable Java Chapman. Java, how you doing this morning?
Man, I'm okay, Russ. I'm okay. I don't know about incomparable and all that kind of stuff, but I'm here on a Wednesday.
I'm just trying to build you up, my man. Just trying to build you up. You can listen to us every Wednesday at 10 a.m. The show will run. You can also find us on all of your download platforms for podcasts, whether that's Apple, Spotify, whatever else you might be using. We're also being live streamed on YouTube, so you can do that. As I said last week, Mama always said I had a face for radio, but we'll do the live stream as well. Look, last week, our very first episode, we had in Governor Tate Reeves for an hour-long conversation. Got to know him a little bit as a person, which I think we really want to do on this show when we're talking to folks is really understand what makes them tick, how they came to where they are with their worldview, how they approach issues, and kind of the formulation or the shaping of that worldview. Every once in a while, though, I want to sit down with you, the listener, and have deep conversations. And today we are going to do that. And there couldn't be a better time to do it because obviously in just a few days, we're going to have this big thing called an election. Already millions and millions of votes have been casted early. But this is something that's been building, I guess, since the last election because we no longer really have dead periods. We go from election to election, but the end is nigh. We will find out on Tuesday, maybe or maybe not. Who's going to be the president, who's going to control the Senate, who's going to control Congress, and even what it looks like in Mississippi with several judicial races that are hotly contested. Of course, there's the risk that in a very tight race, we end up seeing days, if not weeks, of additional questions around ballot counting. There's the risk of litigation. It's possible that Tuesday won't be the end, but I am praying and hoping. I would have been all right if it had been done a month ago. Java, tell us, what is the call and text line?
So, yeah, there's several ways to get in touch with us during this show and all of our shows. You could call 1-877-672-7464. That's 877-672-7464. You can email thesitdown@mpbonline.org, or my personal favorite, you can use the Talk to Us feature inside the MPB Public Media app. It's absolutely free to download, and then you can send a voice note. You can even send videos. You can send pictures, so you can connect to the show all kinds of ways. And for all of our YouTube watchers, you can actually hit us up in the YouTube chat. So easy.
So many ways to weigh in and let us know what you're thinking about the election, how you feel about the candidates, who you got winning. And we'd love to hear all of that and really would love to go even deeper than that, maybe to talk about some of the issues that are on the table. You know, I think our country is facing a fairly serious moment. And I'll back up and give some context for what I'm about to say. There is a thought process that happens whether you are a Democrat or Republican, liberal, conservative, anything in between, that is increasingly negative about our country, about the opportunities available in our country. And I think if you really back up and look at the long-term trajectory, you know, sometimes you'll have people pine for the good old days, back in the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, and you hear that sort of rhetoric. The reality is that in 1950, the median household income was less than half of what it is today, adjusted for inflation. The reality is that we have 11 more years of life today than what we had in 1950. The reality is that a 1950s house was 1,000 square foot. The average house today is 2,500 square feet and filled with amenities. And I know that's not true for everyone, but that's the average. Right? And across the board, we have a cell phone in our pocket right now, right, that is more powerful than supercomputers that used to take up entire warehouses. And so by a lot of objective measures, our quality of life, the opportunities available to us, We work 8 hours less a week now than what we did in the 1950s. So we have more leisure time than we used to have. We travel more than we used to. All of those things point to an improvement in lifestyle over the last 50 to 70 years. That's pretty dramatic. And yet you have a lot of folks who are fixated on the negative because the negative sells. The negative is how you motivate people to action. So that's one side of the equation. I think the other side of the equation is this. You also have serious challenges facing the country. And those two things are not incongruous, right? Or incongruent. You have a clear sign of life improving, but also a recognition, sort of if you follow the stock market, that past performance is not indicative of future success, that there are challenges that could weigh down the opportunities that are available to people, that are arguably already weighing down the opportunities that are available to people. You know, we certainly have talked about inflation a ton over the last several years. I think people in some respect are tired of talking about inflation, but they're even more tired of experiencing it, right? Groceries are up close to 30%. The cost of fuel up more than 30%. All of these things across the board that if you're struggling to make ends meet, make it really difficult, really, really difficult. And so that's one of those issues where we're actually seeing the inflation rate start to come down. But it's a little bit like you saying, okay, well, I got 8 speeding tickets in January. I got 6 in February. I got 5 in March. I got 4 in April, and I got 2 in May. Yeah, you're not getting speeding tickets at the same rate, but you're still accruing speeding tickets, right? The price of things is still going up. And so for a lot of folks, particularly in Mississippi, where median household incomes are not as high in a lot of other places in the country, experience the difficulty of making decisions between, do I fill up my gas tank or do I buy a full load of groceries? And look, I can remember being a kid, not coming for much, and we would go to the gas station. My mom might hand me $3 or $4 to go into the gas station to say, we want $3 worth of gas. Not fill up, but we had $3 and that's what we were going to put in the car. I think there are people today that have some of those same struggles as they've seen prices go up. You've got this crisis at the border that both political parties now recognize. And I want to be very careful not to sound xenophobic. Like, migration and immigration is a net positive to our country. It is a net good. You know, my ancestors came over from Italy in 1917, and they worked their way from New York to Chicago to New Orleans, and then eventually we got to Mississippi. I say that recognizing that our country is both a nation of immigrants and a nation of laws. But the nation has an interest in making sure that people coming into the United States are well vetted, that they don't pose a safety risk. All of those things are reasonable expectations. And there's been real difficulty at the border, a real influx that has made it really impossible for our system to work over the last several years. You've got these foreign conflicts that pose new threats. Obviously, the situation in Ukraine and Russia, the situation with Israel and Palestine, or Hamas rather in Gaza, you know, those are things that impact America and that impact Americans more than you might realize in a global economy. And with the recognition that we have treaties with a lot of these countries that require us to take their side, right? We got to honor those things. And so all of that is unfolding in a way that I think creates uncertainty. There's economic uncertainty about the future of work. And that is the backdrop against which we are having an incredibly contentious election in a sea of recent contentious elections. And so if you look at what is happening over the last several months, if you look at what will happen on Tuesday, we are on pace for an election based on polling that is going to sharply divide the country. Java, you and I were talking about this before we came on air. It's like it felt like in the past you would have a presidential election, and whether it was a Republican or a Democrat that drew ahead, at the end of the day, they would get 53, 54% of the vote. Now we're talking about a situation where both candidates are polling under 50%.
These tight races, man. I remember the day where you know, the president would be decided, or the presidency would be, you know, given to the winner. There will be declared a winner that night, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night. On the late night, it would be midnight. But nowadays, I'm waiting to see what's going to happen 3 weeks from next Tuesday.
It is so incredibly tight. And what it means for our country, I mean, there are really different visions, I think, for how we move forward in a lot of ways. I think there's also this element of, are we going to be in a place to have the institutions strong that historically have made America strong, right? It used to be that people had real belief in civic institutions, whether we were talking about the role of the church in a community or the role of the legislative body or the role of the courts or the president or the media or whatever. And that trust has been undermined across the board. If you look at Gallup polling as an example, what you'll see is that in all of those areas, approval and trust are declining. And without those civic institutions kind of binding us together, how do we move forward? The sociologist Jonathan Haidt talks about this idea that historically countries have been successful if they are bound by values, what he calls God, but bound by values, bound by common blood, or bound by a common enemy. And if you look right now in America, there is divergence on the values that sort of make this country what it is, or historically have made this country successful. I think there is, we've never been a country of common blood. That's not a bad thing, but we've never been a country of common blood. And occasionally we've had common enemies, but that's not on the playing field right now either. So the question then becomes, what binds us as a nation as we move forward past Tuesday's election? Because look, whatever the case may be, someone will be crowned president between Tuesday's election and inauguration. And as a country, we're going to have to decide, and candidly as a state, we've got to decide how we can move forward together. When we come back, we're going to dig into the individual races, talk about the people, the places, and the issues that are going to decide Tuesday's election. Welcome back to the Sit Down with Russ Latino. Glad to be with you on this beautiful Wednesday day. It's a good day to be a Mississippian. Java.
Oh, on my microphone. Every day is a good day to be a Mississippian.
I don't disagree with you.
I'm a proud Mississippian all day, every day.
Don't disagree with you. Let's do a little public service real quick. Next Tuesday, the polls open at 7 a.m. They close at 7 p.m. if you're in line, assuming there's a line. After 7, if you were already in the line before 7, after 7, you can stay in the line and still vote. Please remember to bring ID of some sort, driver's license, photo ID, issued by any branch of the government, whether it's state or federal, your passport, a firearm license, a student ID issued by an accredited university or community college, a military ID, or a Mississippi voter ID card. Any of those are acceptable, but please remember to bring it. If you forget it, they'll allow you to vote what is called an affidavit ballot, but better if you just recall to tote it along. You can also go to the Mississippi Secretary of State's website on My Election Day, their tool to locate where you vote, which is important. Sometimes those things change over time. And if you have any difficulty on Election Day, you can call the Secretary of State's Election Division at 1-800-829-6786. So certainly go out and vote. And if you have any problems, that's the intel or information you need to be able to get it done.
Now, speaking of Secretary of State Watson, he was on In Legal Terms back at the top of October. And if you want to check that podcast out, you can check it out along, the In Legal Terms podcast, wherever you get your audio or inside the MPB Public Media app. But also, he did make mention during that show about absentee voting, which is happening now. I know before the break, Russ, you were talking about, a breakdown in institutions in the country. But I think people do have a strong faith in our election process, because the lines for absentee voting that I've seen, even here in Hinds County and around the state, have been long. You can absentee vote until November 5th. You can even mail in your absentee ballot until November 5th. And you said if there's a line, I'm pretty sure on November, what is Election Day? November 5th?
Yes.
Yeah, there will be lines. There will be lines.
And that's a good sign, right? That's a sign that people are taking seriously their role in shaping our country and being a part of this constitutional republic, this democracy that we've got as a country. I will say, too, that in-person absentee voting is also available this coming Saturday. So lots of ways to make sure that you vote. There have been some interesting legal cases, including one coming out of Mississippi around some of the voting laws. There was just a U.S. Supreme Court case that allowed Virginia to purge 1,600 voters that were allegedly either not living there anymore, died, or were not U.S. citizens. And so that took place today. And then late last week, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals overturned a law that the Mississippi legislature had passed in 2020 that allowed for mail-in ballots to be counted up to 5 days after the election if they were postmarked by the election day. That won't impact this year's election. And so it made a lot of big headlines, but the way that the legal process works is that there's a certain deadline by which to either appeal that or to seek reconsideration in the Fifth Circuit. That deadline goes past the November 5th election. And so if for some reason your ballot arrives within 5 days after the election this year, it will still be counted in future years. It will not be, assuming that the Fifth Circuit's decision holds. And that decision really is based around this idea that Congress sets an election day and that ballots are supposed to be cast and received by that day. But we'll follow how that goes. The short version, though, is it won't impact you this election cycle, in case that is a concern. Let's talk a little bit about what's on the ballot in Mississippi before we dig into the big hairy beast that is waiting for us in the presidential election. Obviously we've got congressional races across Mississippi. None of them are sexy. And maybe that's not a bad thing, but when I say they're not sexy, what I mean is that they're not hotly contested, right? We've got 4 congressional districts in Mississippi. 3 are controlled by Republicans. 1 is controlled by Democrats. And the effect of that is that for the foreseeable future, the 1st Congressional District, the 3rd Congressional District, and the 4th Congressional District will be occupied by a Republican. The 2nd Congressional District is going to be occupied by a Democrat, and more specifically, Benny Thompson, because I think he's there as long as he wants to be there. Certainly, you saw in the 4th Congressional District last time that an incumbent Republican can be beaten, but they can be beaten by another Republican. Stephen Palazzo had represented the 4th Congressional District for a while. Sheriff Mike Ezell from Jackson County came in and unseated him. In all of those races, with the exception of Congressman Michael Guest's race in Congressional District 3, they do have opponents. So Trent Kelly, who is the Republican congressman from the 1st Congressional District, has an opponent in Diane Black. Benny Thompson has a Republican opponent in Ron Eller. And then Mike Ezell has a Democrat opponent in Craig Raybon. I don't want to discount any of those folks for having the courage to put their name on the ballot. It takes a lot of courage to do that. Those districts just operate in a way where it's pretty easy to say that, Trent Kelly's probably going to win District 1. Benny Thompson's going to win District 2. Guest is unopposed, so that's easy in District 3. And then Mike Ezell in 4. On the U.S. Senate, that's another race that I think people either aren't paying attention to, or if they are, assume an outcome. Long-term incumbent Roger Wicker is on the ballot again. He's running against Ty Pinkins. Wicker has taken on this almost Thad Cochran senior statesman role from a Mississippi Senate standpoint. And I think what you're going to see in that particular race is that Roger Wicker could outperform Donald Trump in Mississippi, because I think that there will be a chunk of African-American vote that views Roger Wicker as a reasonable option, as a good government kind of guy. And I suspect that he will end up pretty easily cruising to victory in that race against Pinkins. Again, nothing against Ty Pinkins. He entered the Secretary of State race late this last cycle in 23 after Shawaski Young dropped out. Shawaski Young, coincidentally, last week announced that he's leaving the Democratic Party. But you had him enter that Secretary of State race, and he ended up losing that race to Michael Watson by 20 points. It's hard to imagine, given the incredible gulf on name ID, on resources, the natural sort of leaning of our state, that Roger Wicker is in any real kind of trouble. And my anticipation is that he actually will outperform, like I said, even former President Trump in Mississippi. Where it gets interesting. So I just told you a bunch of stuff, and you sat there and went, yeah, duh, right? We know what's going to happen in those races. Where it gets interesting is in some of the judicial races that are happening in Mississippi this election cycle. A lot of people probably don't even realize that those races are unfolding right now. But you've got 2 Supreme Court races that are hotly contested. So Jim Kitchens, who is the incumbent from the central area of Mississippi on the Supreme Court, is being challenged by State Senator Jennifer Branning. Jennifer Branning ran for the state Senate as a Republican. Judicial races are nonpartisan, which means that they're not able to label themselves or identify themselves. But what you've seen in that race is really a partisan alignment without directly labels, right? Democrats, by and large, are supporting Kitchens. Republicans, by and large, are supporting Branning's candidacy. There are other candidates in that race. Former appeals court judge Ceola James is in that race. They've got 2 private attorneys in that race. But the anticipation is that it's going to come down between Kitchens and Branning. I believe that there probably will be a runoff in that race, for what it's worth. But that's a race to watch. You potentially have an incumbent justice of the Mississippi Supreme Court being unseated, and certainly a different judicial philosophy coming to play from Branning, who's more of an originalist, sort of conservative attorney, a way of thinking about the world. The other Supreme Court race that is potentially interesting is incumbent Don Beam is facing a challenge from David Sullivan, a Gulfport-based attorney. And that's a race that I think on the front end people didn't anticipate being that hotly contested. But it's certainly one that is one to be watched because I do think that there are some dynamics there that could end up making that closer than what a lot of people thought it would be. The last one that I'll mention is a Court of Appeals race down on the Mississippi Gulf Coast where Chancery Court Judge Jennifer Slogel is running against Amy St. Pei. That St. Pei name down on the coast is a big name, well-known Pascagoula attorney. And then an assistant district attorney in Gulfport named Ian Baker is also in that race. So all three of those races probably are the most interesting races in Mississippi. They're probably the hardest races in the state to call. And so as you're watching Mississippi, understand Congress, 3 of the 4 are going to Republicans. Benny's going to hold his seat. Roger Wicker's going to cruise to victory. But watch for these judicial races. They have more impact than you think. You're listening to The Sit Down with Russ Latino. When we come back, we'll dig into the big one, the presidency. What does it look like? How's it going to turn out? Back in just a moment. Welcome back to The Sit Down with Russ Latino. Glad to be with you today as we do our little pre-election extravaganza, go through the people, the issues, and the places that are ultimately going to decide the balance of power in these United States. Java, always good to be with you. And by the way, your intro of me sounds way cooler than me.
No, well, I cannot take all the credit for that, even though I did choose the song. But we have a nice production library that we can choose from. And I said, I think this has a nice little country twang to it, but you can still hear that 808 in there when the beat drops. So I can dig it.
I like it, man. And glad to be with you today as we go through kind of what to expect next Tuesday. I know there's been a lot of punditry around this race. I know that people, if you're a Republican right now, you believe Donald Trump's going to win. And if you're a Democrat, you believe that Kamala Harris is going to win the race. And the expectation comes with great confidence. What I will tell you is anyone speaking with great confidence right now about this race is not paying attention. Anyone who thinks that they can haul out the crystal ball and say with certainty, this is what will happen next Tuesday or whenever all the votes are finally counted, is not being honest. They may end up being right because they got a 50% chance, but it won't be because they knew something. I do think, though, that there are some incredibly interesting dynamics and issues at play in this election that speak to the trajectory of where voters are going to end up and which issues are going to end up being the big issues for the parties moving forward.
Now, Russ, before you get into that, let me ask you a question that sometimes comes across these pundits, talking points and things like that. What about voters, non-voters, people who will abstain, the people who will choose the couch over the ballot box, the ones who were saying, I would, hold my nose for anybody I vote for, so I'm just not going to vote at all. What do you think about those kind of people?
I think there's an element of that, certainly, and I think it falls into two categories. I mean, there are the people that look at it and say, I'm tired of voting for what I perceive to be as the lesser of two evils.
Yeah, there you go, lesser of two evils.
And because of that, I just choose not to validate this process. I think there's also an element that sometimes we maybe give too much credit to of people who just aren't paying attention at all and really are pretty apathetic. And, I would love to find a way to motivate those folks to understand the issues, to understand how their vote ultimately impacts their life. I think, though, that there's always going to be a segment of folks that just decide this politics thing isn't for me. I don't really care. And at some level, if you're not willing to invest the time to understand, then I'm all right with you sitting on the couch. I am, right? And so I used to get text from people who were in the line vote, and I would say, who do I vote for today? Or, hey, there are races on this ballot that I know nothing about. Tell me who to vote for. And I would give thoughts, but it always made me a little uncomfortable that people are like playing eeny, meeny, miny, mo on a ballot on something that could be really important, right? And
true. And
for the longest time, down ticket races, if your last name was the first last name, right? If you had an A last name, you had a much higher percentage of winning a down ticket race because people just didn't know and they'd pick the first guy or gal. That's problematic in my mind.
And then sometimes when there are a lot of races, there are races on the back of the ballot.
Yeah. And look, in those circumstances, I understand that on some of those races you get to and you're like, I have no idea. I would say in those instances, if somebody were asking for Russ's advice, if you have no idea, just skip that one, right? Vote on the ones that you know and skip the one that you have no idea who the candidates are. Because for all you knowing, you're voting for someone who disagrees with everything you actually believe, right?
True.
So that's dangerous. Let's talk a little bit about how the race looks from a polling perspective, right? So I look a lot at the Hill's average of polls. I also look at 538 that does an average of polls, and then Real Clear Politics does one as well. Looking at the Hill average of polls today, this morning, Kamala Harris is up on Donald Trump nationally by 0.6 percentage points. And as you know, that is well within the margin of error, right? And so that gives you a sense nationally of how close this thing is. But what I would also say is national polls at some level are irrelevant, right? There are battleground states that ultimately will decide the outcome of this election. So you got to look at Arizona, you got to look at Georgia, you got to look at Michigan, Nevada, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Those 7 are the 7 that ultimately decide the map and who gets over that 270 mark to become president. So what do the polls in those states say? Well, Arizona, according to the Hill, has Trump up by 2.2 points. Biden won that state in 2020. Georgia, Trump up 1.7 percentage points. Biden won that state in 2020. Michigan, Harris up by 0.3. Biden won that state in 2020. Nevada, Trump up 0.7. Biden won that state in 2020. North Carolina, Trump up 1.4. He won that one in 2020. Pennsylvania, Trump up 0.6. Biden won that state in 2020. Wisconsin, Trump up 0.6. Biden won that state in 2020. So you may be listening to that and you may go, well, clearly Trump is going to win. He's up in all of these states. But again, look at the numbers. We're talking about 0.3s and 0.7s, well within the margin of error. Those polls are just so darn tight. And then you get into this question about, well, do we even trust polls? Because in 2016, Trump underperformed in the polls and then ultimately was able to win the presidency.
And my thing with polls, Russ, is I don't know. You just listed off those states, those swing states, battleground states, and they have all the polling. I here in Mississippi have never taken a poll, but I've always been told to look toward the polls. Who is taking these? Have you taken polls, Russ?
Yes.
Who's taking polls?
No, I have. I have. And look, there's actually a real science behind it. I think the difficulty is when we went from landlines to cell phones, they had to adjust there because it became a lot harder to get people on cell phones for a while. They figured that part out. And I think they're actually pretty good at figuring out the right demographic mixes based on previous election cycles. The problem is that when your numbers are this close, it's really hard to assess and say, well, that's a clear indicator that we're heading one direction or the other. So in 2016, Trump underperformed in the polls because you had people who were hidden Trump voters who didn't want to say they were for Trump, but they were for Trump. In 2022, the polls said that Republicans were going to win way more congressional seats than they won. It was supposed to be a red wave, and that didn't happen, right? So you've got two instances where the polls haven't perfectly put a pin on it. The race is just tight. The other thing that I think is important when you're looking at this stuff is that the polls that are currently out right now don't reflect the closing messages, right? And so a lot of what's happened in the last few days really won't be understood until after we've actually had the final poll, which is the election itself. And so we don't know how the closing messages are impacting. And the third thing that I would say is this. There, in 2016, and I alluded to this, there were hidden voters. And the way that political scientists talk about those hidden voters is essentially that those were people who liked Donald Trump, who liked his message, but felt social pressure not to identify that way. But in the privacy of a voting booth, were willing to step in and push the button for the guy that they liked. I think there's the chance not only of hidden Trump voters this cycle, but I think there's a real chance of hidden Harris voters this cycle. And what I mean by that is that you've got folks that maybe look at Trump and look particularly at the end of his presidency, some of the issues around January 6th, some of the questions around sort of his personal approach and style. And even though they may agree with Republicans or Trump more on the issues, are they going to step into the booth and say, I'm ready for a change in direction within my own tribe, right? And so I'm not saying that will happen, but I think that it's something to look for and figure out how big is the segment of people who historically have voted Republican that are now going to make a different decision in the privacy of the booth. And there's some indication that that is happening even in the polls. And so I'll give really quickly a prelude to some thoughts around realignment. But it seems like the conversation right now is that Donald Trump may draw in more working class Latino voters, that he may draw in more working class, particularly men, black voters. And on the flip side, that Kamala Harris is increasing a lead when it comes to college-educated white voters that historically have voted Republican. And so you've got this interesting moment. And I'm not saying it's, 1968 realignment of parties, but you see a change, at least in the polls, and we'll see if this bears out, that suggests that Donald Trump is going to do better than Republicans historically have done with Latino voters and black voters, and that Harris is going to do better with college-educated white voters.
Now, I know we're coming up on a break, Russ, but I think this last segment will be served well because we've heard from Russ, but now we want to hear from you. 1-877-672-6710. 7464 is the number to call, 1-877-672-7464, or you can send an email to thesitdown@mpbonline.org. Russ, you looking forward to some calls, man?
Bring it on. Let's go. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to the Sit Down with Russ Latino. Glad to be with you today as we do our pre-election extravaganza. Next week, we're going to have Elise Jordan join us. Elise is a Mississippian, was in George W. Bush's second term White House, and now is a political contributor at NBC News and MSNBC News, a wealth of information. So we're looking forward to having Elise on the day after the election. You know, on the issues, you're talking about inflation and border crisis, foreign conflict, crime. Trump leads in the polls on all those issues. Harris leads on abortion, which is obviously a hot button issue. But none of that is really driving, in my opinion, what's likely to occur on Tuesday. And you see it in the final messages. You see the final message of Donald Trump about Harris as being a woke candidate. And you see the message about Trump from Harris about him being a fascist, right? And so we have gotten to the point in the campaign where we are throwing the most extreme things that we can throw at people against the wall. And that tells you that it's very unlikely that ultimately the decision in this race for most people will be on the issues. It's going to be on the candidates themselves. And I suspect a lot of people are motivated not to vote for someone, but to vote against someone this election cycle. That being said, we're going to take a caller. Adam from Biloxi. Adam, how are you doing today, man?
I'm good, Russ. How about you?
I cannot complain. I find it does very little good. What you know?
Well, okay, so first I'm thankful for this program and thankful for MPB and certainly NPR I check in pretty much every day. I told at one of the fundraisers that I'd love to contribute to, to help the effort because I do enjoy the programming. But, I was not hearing enough local news and local coverage, to help empower Mississippians to make good decisions. And so when your show was billed or, I heard the description of your show, I was so excited. And then I got to day one last week, your first show, and you had Tate Reeves, and you can just imagine my excitement, dude. I was I was like, wow, this is great. Now, just a comment. I thought I would have liked to have heard a little bit more criticism, if that makes sense, as far as certainly challenging Governor Reeves a bit, on different issues, because he is the governor of our state. It is our state, and I certainly want, to see our state thrive and all of us thrive. But I just really wanted, a little bit more challenge.
Yeah, Adam, look, I can appreciate that. I think the format of this show and really the goal of this show is to have deep, meaningful conversations. And I think we did get into a lot of issues that Mississippians really, really care about, right? We talked about education. We talked about healthcare access. We talked about a lot of stuff that is percolating in the legislature or has been discussed in the legislature in recent years, whether it's tax reform or PERS, you name it. And so I think we covered a lot of ground. I don't think my goal is to have an argument show, right? My goal is to have a learning show where we get insight into the way that the people that we're talking to are thinking about issues. And so I understand the desire for challenge. And I think there will be moments in coming interviews where you see that challenge. But I think if what you're looking for is a crossfire type show, right, where folks really bandy about and hit each other, that's not necessarily the aim of the program. The aim of the program is to learn together. And I hope you'll continue to give us a chance, because I think long term, what you're going to see is an opportunity for finding common ground with folks that maybe you didn't think there was common ground on. But really appreciate your call.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you, and certainly good luck with the show. If you can find some of those moments, that would be awesome.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And Adam, thank you for your call. Certainly, I think what I am hoping to do in the last couple of minutes is to tie a bow on what we've been talking about this entire episode, which is really what to look forward to next election cycle. What I will tell you is that, whatever happens in the race for the White House, whether we're looking at a Harris administration or a Trump administration, we're going to have a change in the Senate composition. And so what you have right now, and this is not being talked about very much because everybody's so fixated on the White House, but what you have right now is a Senate with 48 Democrats, 3 independents who all caucus with Democrats, which means they really technically have a 51-seat majority, plus the vice president to break ties, and then 49 Republicans. The way the Senate map sets up this election year is you have Joe Manchin in West Virginia retiring, and that is a state that Donald Trump won every county in, both in 2016 and 2020. So Manchin was an independent caucusing with the Democrats. He's retiring. West Virginia is going to overwhelmingly be won by a popular Republican governor named Jim Justice. That will be a seat pickup for Republicans. And then in Montana, incumbent John Tester is facing the fight of his life and currently down 7 to 8 points, which is outside the margin of error, to a guy named Tim Cheehey in Montana. And the expectation is that seat will flip. So it's looking like Republicans will have a minimum of 51 seats in the Senate come the next cycle of Congress. You also have 4 sort of toss-up states, if you will, that are potential pickups in Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Some of those races are really going to depend on what happens in the presidential race. I think, if for some reason Donald Trump is able to win those states, he will pull some of those folks along. I think if Harris wins those states, she helps save some of those incumbents' jobs in those states. And so there is a sea change that is going to happen in the U.S. Senate, regardless of what happens in the presidency. So if you are a Republican and you're looking at a Harris presidency, you know that there's going to be a firewall in the Senate. I think if you're a Republican and you're looking at a Trump presidency, you think there's the potential to actually get some legislation done. Now, the flip side of that is the U.S. House. The margin there is so small that I think that you very well could see a scenario in which the Senate flips to the Republicans and the House flips back to the Democrats. A lot of that is going to be based on what happens in the presidential itself. I want to close with this before next Tuesday. Whatever happens on Tuesday, we're going to be all right. Whatever happens next Tuesday, if your neighbor voted for Trump and that makes you mad, that person's still your neighbor. If your neighbor voted for Harris and that makes you mad, that person is still your neighbor. They're not your enemy. And on a day-to-day basis, the things that affect our life aren't decided in Washington, D.C. They're decided right here at home. They're decided in the decisions that we make for our families, for our businesses, for our communities. They're decided in how we interact with each other and work together. And so if you're discouraged or you're angry or you're anxious, take a deep breath. It's going to be all right one way or the other. We're going to get through this because, by golly, we're Americans and we're Mississippians, and we know how to make it work. You've been listening to The Sit Down. It's been a real joy to be with you today. This is Russ Latino signing off. Join us every Wednesday at 10 a.m. right here on MPB Think Radio.